Taylor, Head of Technical SEO at Salt. Again, I don't think you and I have met before, so hey, Dan.
Hey Chris, nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Where are you located?
I'm in Leeds at the moment in the UK.
Okay, very cool. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, sure. So, hey everyone, my name is Dan Taylor, as Chris has introduced. I'm the head of technical SEO at Salt Agency. Prior to that, I was the head of research and development. We are a predominantly technical SEO agency who also specialize in kind of demand gen and visibility growth. Predominantly work with companies in the US and international campaigns. So people like Cloudflare, Proton Mail, Reformation, etc. Those kind of brands.
All right, you're going to talk about tackling enterprise level SEO problems. That's a big piece of cake to tackle, right? I'm personally very excited for your presentation. We have about 30 minutes here, so why don't we dive right in? I'm sure there's going to be quite a few questions. So, yeah, let's listen to Dan here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Do you want me to share my screen, Chris, or?
You're going to have to click on present, and then do you have your presentation open?
Yeah, I do. I was
Yeah,
prepared.
click on present, and then just select your presentation.
Yep, ready to go.
There we go. Excellent. Cool.
Awesome. Well, hey again, everyone. So, as Chris said, I'm going to be predominantly talking about tackling enterprise level SEO issues. And in this, I'm not going to just try to focus on the actual individual or the technical parts of this. I'm also going to go over and talk around the more nuances that enterprise level relationships can bring, because more often than not, a lot of the same problems you see at enterprise level are the same at medium or SME level, just amplified. But there's often more bureaucratic red tape, different processes, and usually a lot more technical debt to kind of go through. So another quick overview. I won't dwell on this too much, but like I said, head of technical SEO at Salt Agency. And if you want to follow me on any socials, I've got my Twitter, my Mastodon, and my YouTube link there, as well as a couple of web addresses if you want to find out more on the blogs that we go over, resources, etc. I also want just to cover as well, this year, Salt Agency, we became the first and unfortunately the only SEO agency to receive a royal seal of approval from Her late Majesty the Queen, which was presented to us by now King Charles III. So this was through work predominantly for international trade and innovation, so working with international brands, and it's a nice award that we can now proudly use for the next 5 years. So, like I said, today I'm going to go over 4 main key areas. And we're going to cover across indexing problems and essentially how indexing is becoming harder, especially on larger websites. And this is quite timely given that Google yesterday released a changing their terminology around ranking systems and actually parts of the algorithm. So we have some good information there. How to actually go about managing sites with high levels of user-generated content, or where content is your main offering piece. How to, in my opinion, one of the most undersold parts of enterprise, and that's the support sections and how to amplify those for SEO and brand visibility. And then also one of the important things in enterprise, which is the feedback loop and also stakeholder management when you're dealing with mega brands of international teams, and everyone has different objectives and everyone has a different opinion on how things should go, but the end objective needs to be the same. So I also want to cover off 3 enterprise truths before we start. And that's that when you're working on sites of large scale or even medium scale, perfect doesn't exist. At Salt, we talk about technical excellence, but technical excellence at enterprise really is a working proficiency for a website, given its technical debt, its stack, and other history, that it can actually achieve its organic and marketing objectives. It might not be pretty. There might be some tools flagging red in certain areas in certain places, but as long as it's not affecting the bottom line, Technical excellence is what is excellence for the business. The second element of the truth is about methodical prioritization. And that is, we know in SEO, some things are more impactful than others. We have our own anecdotal experiences. We have our own work. It's not, when it comes to enterprise, it's not so much focusing on, as I've said, the size of the issue, but it's how we can create an effectiveness. And stakeholders love to see effectiveness, and they love to see the effect and efficiencies as well as the overall performance gains. And that brings me on to the third point, which is that stakeholders do matter. And at enterprise, very, very rarely, as a vendor relationship, you're siloed into a single team. In some enterprises we work with, that is the case, but more often than not, you tend to be joining a Scrum call, which has somebody from brand, UX, engineering, product. It depends on how different enterprises run, but with more business unit structures, that is going to be something you're going to encounter a lot more. And with that, you need to learn and understand how stakeholders work and how to actually manage not so much just what you're doing, but how you can better communicate what you're doing to the multiple stakeholders who ultimately need to like you. Because no matter what performance gains you get, if you're not liked, it's hard to get a re-sign on the contract for extensions. And another thing in enterprise is that there's never three things. Everything's always connected. Unless you're in siloed sprints doing title tags or canonicals, there'll be connections to other departments. There'll be reasons why certain things are happening the way they are. And it's about stakeholder management, it's from methodical prioritization, and it's understanding the need that perfect might not exist. But if it works and it's better than what it was before, and it's not being black hat or sneaky, then that is perfect for that organization. Cookie cutter very, very rarely works at this level, and it doesn't cut the mustard, especially when you're dealing with sophisticated users and sophisticated individuals. So let's talk about mega indexing. Indexing coverage reports in Search Console are something we all look at, something we all like. For me, they're also something which is greatly misunderstood. Now, obviously, it looks at the trends over time. We can overlay impressions, which is useful. And we can also see correlations in indexing between unconfirmed and confirmed Google updates. It's understanding, really, this report shows how Google feels about your website. As you can see in the example I've included here, there's just under 67 million pages indexed and 72 million not indexed. There's reasons for that, in fact 15 reasons. I'm not going to go for all 15 here, but generally more often than not, indexing is something that I see more and more commonly being raised across Twitter, Mastodon, Reddit, etc. over the past kind of year or so. With indexing, Google themselves have come out publicly. Gary Ilyesh did at a conference, and Lily Ray greatly shared a photo of it on Twitter, and that's a strong reference for it. It's that 60% of the internet in Google's eyes is duplicate content. Duplicate content not necessarily being the exact words on the page, but it's duplicate value propositions. 60% of the internet is saying exactly the same as each other. So there's no desire, there's no impetus to invest in heavy amounts of indexing resources and storage and caching for essentially the same thing that's going to bring zero user benefit. As I said, anecdotally, since November 2021, we've seen more and more indexing fluctuations across any websites, predominantly 100,000 URLs plus, even on some we work with which have just under 1 billion URLs. We're seeing these indexing fluctuations because Google's determining what is and isn't valuable to have in its immediate indexing and then for retrieval. With this, we also can see a shift in what is happening with this, and this is going to impact enterprise, and it's ultimately also going to impact medium and small as well, especially where you're competing with what SEOs always complain about for brand preference, so you're competing with known names or elements like that. We already have Google's indexing API for specific post types, and we have index now in various stages of adoption through multiple search engines. It's not beyond the realm of possibility with what we're seeing that we're going to have to become more prioritized with how we index and actually start focusing on the core pages when we're trying to deal with multi-100 million URL websites at the enterprise level, we already have that problem. We're not going to get every URL indexed. And even if we go through the no index tile and we strip out all the parameters, all the redirects, all the canonicalized URLs, etc., there's still a heavy percentage which won't be indexed. John Mueller's publicly said 20% of the website not being indexed is normal. That's probably going to carry on to grow bigger as a percentage, regardless of whether or not they're detritus URLs and parameters, etc. we didn't want anyway. So technically, the common reasons why we have this indexing problem are to do with quality thresholds, that essentially the page has fallen below what Google perceives as required for that source type. Now, source types can differ between e-commerce sites, informational sites. It's all different kind of brand levels. Each one has a different quality threshold, and this is why on SERP or search engine results pages where we have a mixture of commercial, informational, and different SERP features, they all have different quality types, which gets pulled together, which makes keyword difficulty scoring at SERP level, which I know a lot of tools do, pretty much redundant now. But also to the point that it's not just you have to not just compete for that keyword, you have to compete with your source type of that keyword. The second main issue, you see these issues in Search Console, is essentially data delays. Search Console has different data pipelines and different parsing procedures for different reports. Sometimes you'll go and do a site search for URL, you'll see it in Google search, you'll look in Search Console, and it'll say it's not indexed. 2 days later, everything's fine. That happens more often than not, and when you're dealing with massive amounts of URLs, that's extremely common to see, and you almost have to take reporting over time versus ad hoc single-day reporting. Other issues go down to your content value proposition, which again impacts your quality threshold. And the fourth reason is simply you could be asking Google to index and process more URLs than you actually deserve to have. I've seen people in Slack groups and Reddit groups over the past 2-3 months launching 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 programmatically built pages when their website previously only had about 5,000 pages. You're suddenly asking Google to index and give resource to a lot more pages, and it will do it slowly and do it over time. You can't just flip a switch and ask Google to do that. When you're at an enterprise, I keep saying the enterprise level, or when you're dealing with over 100 million URLs, you almost have to sculpt pseudo HTML sitemaps just to keep Google keep hitting actual URLs you want it to crawl, and to try and keep it focused. Otherwise, you can lose it down rabbit holes. We see that in log files quite a lot. It'll go down a rabbit hole, and it won't crawl a solid URL for a week or so. Not that crawl frequency impacts ranking, but when you have high change frequencies or internal link changes, or you're constantly in evolving infrastructure, which a lot of enterprise sites are, making sure fresh URLs are crawled, URLs you want to drop out are crawled or recognized, is a management process which is unlike anything you really see on smaller sites, but it's also about factoring that Google has to have time to do the processing. So the 4 main things I want to talk about with quality thresholds is essentially that Google does have a different quality threshold for different source types. And this is made up of a number of factors. Freshness, we know, is one of these factors. So this occurs when you have a URL which is not indexed. You'll submit it via Search Console's inspect tool. It might appear in indexed for a couple of days, and then it'll drop back out again. That's because the freshness boost took it above the quality threshold, but then once it lost that freshness efficacy, it drops. Freshness doesn't apply to every single query and doesn't apply to every single URL. So again, it might not work in all cases, but that's saying you need to work on other factors. Google's aware of it. You need to improve quality. Similarly with beneficial purposes, Google's definition of this, and this has been around as long as EAT in the quality rating guidelines, and is very pertinent to indexing, is that all pages have a beneficial purpose. The beneficial purpose could be to be informational, it could be to sell something, it could be to get a newsletter sign up, it could be to mask itself as an informational page, but ultimately try to sell a product. Google can understand what the intent and purpose of that page is, no matter how much you mix or mask it. And If it has no beneficial purpose, in other words, it's crossing too many lanes and it's nothing to nobody, then it has a low page quality, which I'm not going to cover too much because that is covered under E quite a bit, and that's basically on the needs met scale. And even if you have no beneficial purpose, you have a very low page quality. And then the fourth one is the main content supporting content element, and that can be transposed to the design of a page, the main block, the main purpose. It's again something which does impact the indexing, especially when you start looking at query and query cluster level. So things you can actionably do outside of this is just actually acknowledge that not all indexing errors in Search Console are actually errors. Some of them is just Google reporting, is just bad terminology calling it an error. For example, if you have a load of parameters and you're purposefully indexing all your parameters, it won't be indexed. The report is not indexed because you've asked it to. That needs to be communicated as well. If you are wanting URLs to be indexed en masse, on scale, you want to make sure that, well, you actually want to eyeball the SERP. You want to look at the different source types you are competing against. If you're an informational source and the top 5 results are commercial and they're selling something, top 5 might not realistically be achievable. You need to aim for your source type on that SERP, and then over time, let Google experiment, see if different results and different source types matter in different places, and then make that decision and allow Google to make that decision, but give it all the tools possible to rank you as highly as possible. The second one is around the beneficial purpose, and I see this a lot at enterprise because a lot of enterprise businesses are quite heavily sales driven and with that business model. So they'll mix heavy sales messaging and heavy product messaging in with informational messaging, which completely skews the purpose of the content. And if Google's unable to determine the beneficial purpose, or is this actually trying to help a user, or is it trying to rank for helpful terms and then sell to the user, you need to unblur those lines, because in my experience, every time you give Google a decision to make, it will oftentimes make the decision against you. And then the third one essentially is about additional value. 60% of the internet being duplicated. Is what you're producing giving additional value, or is it repeating more of the same but in a different way, and in your opinion a better way? And then that's the question of, do you actually deserve for that content to be indexed? Do you deserve for that URL to be shown? Second enterprise level problem we come across a lot is websites who have essentially their business model is based around high volumes of user generated content. So these are your GitLabs, GitHubs, Pinterests, eBays. All their content offering is typically relied on user upload and user input. You need to be able to manage that so that you're returning value still to people searching and encouraging others to use the platform. So again, I break that down into 3 different more examples. So there's the product sites, which are your eBay Gumtrees. You've got your repositories, so your GitLabs, GitHubs, etc., paste bins, whatnot, and then value posts, so your Quoras, Mediums, Pinterests. I think probably to an extent Hive Social now. Twitter probably used to be that until 3 weeks ago. But essentially, all these 3 models rely on that user upload. Now, some have a higher change frequency than others, some have higher upload frequency than others. But the ultimate point of users uploading to that platform is discovery. They either want to be discovered through the internal search on those platforms, or they want to be discovered through external search and have their work adopted, especially in the case of things like Quora, Medium, GitLab, Jenkins. Their whole purpose is people upload to those boards, and if they make them public, they want people to adopt, use the code and the license, and spread reach. So with this, you almost need to, only way to do this at scale is to do priority automation. Other websites have done similar things around this, but essentially you can't make judgment calls when some of these websites have million plus page turnover frequencies every day. It's impossible to do it manually, but you need to work on webhooks and verifications. So one of the systems of doing this for indexing is a karma-based system. So this is actually taking the user account and rewarding good quality posters over time. And that can be things, even if they reward you with advertising elements. So this is, for example, account age. If they verify their account, so you actually have a notion of that person is real, you have a notion of which country that person is in, you might have some other demographic data about a person from the verification that can increase and improve ad targeting. So as a platform, you can sell more, you can generate more revenue through selling advertising and targeting to that individual. Account posting and activity frequency. So one of the big common issues that I faced working on the UGC platforms usually comes around pay-per-view boxing and pay-per-view UFC fighting. You'll have people go, oh, these domains have got very high authority, they're very powerful brands. We'll spin up an Alexander Usyk v Tyson Fury boxing URL, create a user, create a page, and then they'll put a phishing link on there. It will probably get ranked for 5-6 hours. There'll be an appetite for people searching for that, and they fished a few thousand people on the back of piggybacking off a UGC domain. But if you have a karma-based system, that content won't get indexed. So it deters bad actors and also helps with the community contribution as well. The second element around it is indexing API. And again, if the UGC's jobs, broadcasts, or embedded video objects, you can just work with that and make sure that if people are posting jobs, for example, you're doing your utmost to get it indexed as quickly as possible within Google, because no one's like adding to your job board for people not to be able to find it, and people search in different ways. So if you can maximize and reduce friction in that area, you're basically providing a better product and better customer service as well. Third one is the crawl prioritization. So this is almost trying to keep control. So again, this can be done through karma-based systems where new users have a different subfolder in their user URI strings, or they have a specific parameter appended to their profile URLs. And it's about how we dynamically control crawling and indexing of those, or whether or not we just want certain sections blocked off altogether for certain times of the year. We want to prioritize seasonality, etc., or even use seasonal sitemaps or things like that. And then the fourth one is automated internal linking trees. So that is effectively HTML sitemaps that auto-generate links based on internal search, based on page view data being fed back in. So if people are starting to search for more topics due to real-world events, we're creating link trees with low click depth for want of a better word, PageRank distribution. Even though we don't have PageRank scores anymore, we know Google to an extent still uses internal link flow and etc. So we can almost tailor crawl paths dynamically and give Google better paths to trending stuff, which is better for users. The third enterprise trick, which I want to kind of go over, and I say trick because this can be applied to any business of any size, and that's the amplification of support sections. Now, more often than not, when I speak to businesses, they want to drive traffic for commercial keywords. They want to drive traffic for how-tos, things they perceive as being funnel keywords, your tofu, mofu, and bofu stuff, top of funnel, middle funnel, etc. And support sections are equally as powerful in doing this, because with a support section, you can not only tailor for queries which otherwise would be left to be answered by things like Stack Overflow and other random Reddit threads, you can almost tailor this as a retention method as well. You can have people doing the brand search, people have to resolve certain things on your site, and you can also include issues which might not be specifically related to your platform or competitor platforms, and be a sidestep of actually acquiring it and acquiring users or getting in front of users for a secondary conversation. Usually on most support platforms, especially those in companies which are often just starting out, there's typically 3 types of support article. There's the ones which I've called a marketing propaganda, which is posing as something helpful, which is great if it's an onboarding element or a how-to element for that specific platform, great. But often there's a lot of marketing wolves in help sheep's clothing out there, which is neither use nor ornament to anyone. A lot of support forums where users are allowed to upload questions are just thin, unanswered. They get closed after 21 days. It's not maintained, and it just looks bad. It makes your community and your support element look untended, and it's a put off of a brand. And then the worst one of all is when you have it being left, when the questions are basically left to be answered by a community with no moderation. The number of tech companies I've seen who've created Reddit threads for their own company who literally don't monitor it. And then I go in and there'll be someone asking a question, and somebody who admits they're from a competitor is answering the question and almost stealing a customer over, because you just kind of created something because it'll be a social asset, probably posted a few things, didn't get any reach, and it's been left out to pasture. But your user base is asking for help there, and your competitors are answering it. And just to kind of back this up, I included a couple of stats. One from Backlinko, which probably needs verifying, but the 14% of Google searches being a question, and also the 13% of searches for an image, and Google searches are for an image, and 13% search for an image pack. So that my emphasis here is you don't necessarily just have to answer questions with words. You can use diagrams. Diagrams with text and alt text and contextual text around them are really powerful. And because images are seen as a resource have to be built, make a Canva account, do something low cost or accessible, but include that in support articles, include logic trees or flowcharts, because there's an untapped element there which you could get brand visibility in, as well as some SERP real estate. So just kind of give you an idea of how this tactic can work. This is a support subdomain that I worked on a few years ago, and throughout the last 2 quarters of 2016, we basically prepared a load of questions and we had engineers answering them. Some of the answers were 2 words long, some of the answers were 3-4 paragraphs long, some of them included images, some didn't. But it was all questions we were finding people were asking, not about this brand specific products and software, but also more general market software questions, which weren't specific to that brand, but we could probably get away with answering them. And then we published them all in December. It took a while to be crawled because it was a big site. We saw an initial spike in January, a little bit of ups and downs. And then as you can see later towards that year, it just kind of took off. And that is the sessions data there as well, which I've pulled through. And that grew. That's visibility. That is active people, both retention and new customers looking for questions you're answering on the site. And the last thing I wanted to kind of cover off before getting into questions, and this is a very useful tool, I've called this feedback loops of internal teams. It's more than that. It's stakeholder management and it's basic stakeholder practices, which at enterprise level, when you're working with huge teams and not all of them are SEOs, not all of them are even marketers, understanding how to translate what you're doing as an SEO oftentimes is difficult enough, because most of us don't want to talk with certainty about the unknown. So we say it depends, or we add caveats to answers, or we move around things. But understanding how to communicate with the different internal teams helps with this greatly, especially in large elements. So in enterprise teams, this is typically what it looks like. You've got us as an external SEO vendor, you'll have a brand team, you'll have engineering, you'll have product. I put content in internal brackets because content sometimes lives as its own team, sometimes it lives as PR, sometimes it lives even within brand. But sometimes there's multiple content teams. You'll still need to interact with all of them at different points. Some circles and spheres of influence are much bigger in a 5 as well. But it's about understanding who's at the table and who has influence over the strategy, who is doing something which could influence certain things, and having them on side, because they're ultimately going to affect the metrics which we are judged on. So that's why I work with this, and I tell my team members politics in large organizations is almost as important as the internal performance. And one of the best ways of doing this is something called a RACI chart. And that is what this diagram is on the left. It's about understanding who is responsible for the action. It's understanding who is accountable for it, more often than not as the external vendor, the accountability, that the responsibility will fall on the client and the accountability will fall on the vendor, because we're accountable for performance or accountable for providing recommendations, but the client is responsible more often than not for implementing them. In terms of the consulted, this will be your secondary layer of stakeholders. So if we're doing something to a commercial page which revolves around a product, we will consult with the product team. We will ask them questions. We will talk about USPs with them. We'll see if, because they often have great insight into products in the marketplace and into their own product that they're marketing, that can help with messaging. And then there's the tertiary stakeholders. So this could be, in this instance, UX team, brand team, PPC team. It's just keeping them informed. It's keeping them in the loop of activities. We ask other teams for data all the time. We need to keep this loop open in both ways and give them the same element. Simple racy charts like this, and even taking this mantra into how we go and work with them, oftentimes makes better working environments. Now, this is something you can do at enterprise level. This is something you can do at SME or medium level. Even external vendors can go into this. Ultimately, you're going to be accountable for recommendations and the strategy. The client is going to be responsible for implementation. You want to consult external vendors and consult that secondary stakeholder level and inform tertiary vendors and tertiary stakeholders. The CMO or the C-level will often flip between consulted and informed. That will depend on their engagement level, how much they want to know, but typically they'll flip between the two. So on that note, I want to say thank you for having me and for letting me go through the slides of the sort of answer the challenges of enterprise. And yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen, Chris, and hand back to you, and I guess go to questions if there are any.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dan. Why don't we take, we got a lot of questions. Why don't we take a couple of questions here before we move on? I know this is probably a pretty complex question. Maybe give a easier answer. How do you deal with websites that have multiple language versions? Something other than can be done with Canonical.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Annika. So with websites with multiple language versions, hreflang is your first port of call. You want to make sure that your English version is referencing your French version as an alternate, your French as your German as an alternate, and ultimately closing the loop on itself. What typically tends to happen with large sites with multiple language versions is when you start going into the realms of German for Germany, German for Austria, and Germany for Switzerland, because the business might be geared up with different prices or different sales teams for those regions, but you're just replicating the pages. So what you tend to find there is in Search Console, you'll get the Google chose different canonical. I can't remember the exact phrases, like declared canonical, Google chose different or something like that. That's essentially Google looking at the three versions of the page and kind of going, yeah, it's the same value proposition, it's the same content, it's the same language. I'm just going to ignore this and canonicalize to the first one. So with that, you want to make small changes. And when I say small, it could even be the case of header changes, change up some testimonials, just slight differences. So when Google looks at it at face value, goes, this page is tailored for the German market, this one's tailored for the Austrian market, and this one's tailored for Swiss German speakers. But with canonicals and hreflang, you want to make sure there's no conflicts or mismatches there, because that can also break hreflang mapping as well.
Awesome. Let's take one more question. That's an interesting one. Katarina, I recently purchased a domain that was previously associated with a spammy website. What do you do?
So with this, I think it's twofold. If it was associated with a spammy website and the website was spammy, it depends on how much downtime that has had. And when we go into kind of theoretical, if it was spammy and it received a penalty, then the penalty will be associated with the domain. If the penalty has been lifted, then it's lifted. Just don't do anything to trigger it. I'm now going to go into a bit of theoretical here, because technically, if you redirect one domain to another, for example, Google have said that after 180 days, all value from domain A will have been passed to domain B through the redirect. So in theory, the redirect can be broken. if in theory, that's because of that status code. So by theory, if it's been more than 180 days where the URL was not mapped to a DNS, not attached to anything that resolved in a 200, or just resolving something different, that connection in theory could be broken, but that's completely theoretical. The secondary question to this is if the domain is, if your spammy domain did something like pet food, and you're creating a website to sell pet food in the same niche, in the same everything else, then that could carry some weight because that domain's already been associated with spam tactics in that sector. But that's not necessarily to say that you can't recover it. 7-8 years ago, when Google was handing out penguin penalties quite hard, it was possible to recover from them, and you could recover and build significant brands off it. I would just make sure you're doing everything right, doing everything by the book. Depending on what kind of spam it was, if it was things like link spam, you probably don't need to disavow the links, but if it helps put you at rest, I'd disavow some of those links and pull it from a historic backlink history and something like Majestic. But as long as you're building right on it and the penalty doesn't exist or there was no penalty, you should be okay. But then again, the only other downside is if it was a website which has been slandered in the forums for being a fake site or something like that, then that's a brand issue, and then you probably need to work on fresh PR, fresh branding, etc.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much. It was a great presentation, as all of the presentations here today so far.